What's up, guys who follow our YouTube channel, Filosofia? Don't be surprised by the English. Yes, we speak English for this video because today we receive a world-class guest, a very special friend. So if you're not familiar with the language, I strongly recommend you to activate the native subtitles on YouTube, then hit the engine button here and select Automate Translation to Portuguese or whatever language you are familiar with. As I was saying, today we welcome a very special friend, the philosopher, collection director at Presse Universitaire de France and Polity Press, an immensely prolific writer, bibliophile, professor of legal theory at the VUB, one of the most interesting theoreticians on the contemporary European scene, and last but not least, the greatest cocktail expert I have ever known. We welcome today for a quick conversation the philosopher Laurent de Sutter.
Hi.
Laurent is the author of more than 20 books, among which I personally would like to highlight this one, Deleuze, la pratique du droit, Deleuze, a prática do direito. And we're going to talk about this book today with its author. So, my dear Laurent, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to make this quick conversation about your recently published book in Brazil, Deleuze, a prática do direito. This is your first book ever translated into Portuguese. It was published by our beloved State University of Ponta Grossa Press and released at the end of 2019. A book that I had the immense honor and the real pleasure of translating. That said, I would like to address you my first question, if it's okay for you.
Yeah, fine, please, shoot.
Okay. Your Deleuze is an exposition of the main articulations of Gilles Deleuze's philosophy of law. And you say in the introduction that contrary to appearances, there exists in Deleuze a complete system of the philosophy of law. Compared to the French original version, among other editions, the Brazilian translation was augmented with a preface written for the English edition, along with two unpublished appendices. How do you think your book fits in the current debate on Deleuze and the law? Can you precise for our audience in what consists its originality compared to other existing texts on Deleuze and the law?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and for having me. And of course, I would like to thank you for your extraordinary job on this this translation that has been quite long in the making. And I'm so happy to see it finally being published in Brazil. And the fact that it has long been in the making also explains somewhat the or gives a possible answer to your question, namely the fact that actually when I wrote this book and when it was published in French in 2009, so it's more than 10 years ago now, it was actually the first one to be published on the topic, and I would like to claim that it still is the only one. As a matter of fact, there's been a series of books, especially in English, being dedicated, for instance, on the philosophy of rights of Deleuze, or on the link between the idea of normativity in Deleuze and in Bergson, for instance, or on jurisdiction in Deleuze, etc., etc. So there's a whole now library being built around the interest and the somewhat bizarre interest that Deleuze had for law. But the idea of trying to reconstruct systematically what Deleuze thought about law throughout his entire career, because he was interested in law from the onset. I mean, in 1953, when he published his anthology cum introduction on John Locke, it was already there. Up to the very last interviews and interventions, they're everywhere in his work. There are hints, bits and pieces, small sentences, footnotes, observations, like incident digressions around the idea of law, but never addressed as systematically as are addressed all the concepts for which the philosophy of Deleuze is now famous, you know, deterritorialization, body without organs, event, and so on and so forth. So what I tried at that time, and what I still cling to, was to try and see what was the textual material, what was the exact material, the sentences and the footnotes I was talking about, what are they, and how do they work together? When we take all the quotations, all the sentences where Deleuze spoke about law more or less directly, and you put them together, what happens? And when I did that, the observation that I made was that it was not, of course, it was not like some kind of a fling, you know, suddenly I have this idea, I speak about law, and then I jump back to my main focus. No, it was a very deep concern, and a concern that was both biographical, and there's this famous statement from Deleuze saying that if he had not been a philosopher, he would have been judge, he would have studied law, you know, it's in his dialogue with Claire Parnay. So it's both biographical or existential, but also theoretical, because for Deleuze, law, when it is understood and perceived the right way, in a very specific way, law can teach something to philosophy, or can teach something to thought that can help philosophy, or that can help thought explore a radically new path, or a radically new path according to Deleuze. And if Deleuze was so interested in law, it was because, I mean, he felt that he could learn from the practice of law, from a certain practice of law, something that would simply help him perform his project, and help him in such a way that it could even be considered as some kind of a vanguard for the philosophical project that was his, which was the project that he called, you know, transcendental empiricism, which is basically a translation, a European continental translation of pragmatism, you know, American pragmatism, redistributed and re-seen through the lens of Nietzsche and Bergson and others. So what I tried in this book was really that. It was simply to gather together the file, the textual file, and to give the map, and then to see how all the proposals and propositions from the very beginning to the end actually articulated together and built up something which is, I was surprised how systematic it was, because again, it's in clues. It's like in some kind of a police novel that you underlie. Suddenly you discover that there was a whole plot, under the radar, throughout those old years, and said, oh fuck, so there was this thing, and nobody has seen it, but it was everywhere. And when you start to seeing it, it started kind of paranoid, a conspiracy theory thing where, my God, it's everywhere, and it's more than everywhere. It's to a certain point of intensity where actually you realize that it might very well be the most important thing. Let's say, maybe not in Deleuze's work, but or in Deleuze's eyes, but maybe for a contemporary reader of Deleuze, there's something there that should definitely be meditated upon. And I think that it remains a valid point today, and that it's not yet be caught enough. You're one of those who are actually, digging into this direction, but we remain very few, my dear Murilo.
Cool. And when you talk about this map, I noticed that your book on Deleuze and law is divided in two parts. The first one is called Critic, and follows the articulations of a critic of law as the first instance of Deleuze's philosophy of law. The second one is called Clinic, and takes by object not the law in the sense of lex, but the law in the sense of use, la loi, le droit in French. And here we are with a linguistical problem, because English speakers use a single word, law, without discerning what Neo-Latin and Germanic languages do, like loi et droit in French, lei e direito in Portuguese, lex and use in Latin. So we have therefore two conceptual pairs. Firstly, critics or criticism and law, in the sense of loi, lei, lex, and the second, the clínica and the law as droit, direito, or use. So how do these two conceptual pairs engage in Deleuze's philosophy of law? And how do you conceptualize criticism, clinic, and law, this one in both senses, as loi and as droit?
Yeah, well, this is the tough part, because it's it's the core of the whole enterprise. What I realized when I tried to build this, to rebuild this map, this hidden map of Deleuzean treasure on law, what I noticed was that there is indeed a double trajectory or a double endeavor at stake. And this endeavor was, on the first part, there was a very deep, powerful, devastating almost critique of law that was happening, mainly articulated in his introduction to Sacher Mazor. And then there was also a positive part, let's say, that I called, but using one of Deleuze's late concept, a clinique of law, but understood differently. And both parts took the form of some kind of an archaeological or historical or genealogical endeavor within the realm of legality, the realm of law, the realm of rules, the realm of ought to be, and so on and so forth. On the critique part, because we have to be remembered that Deleuze remains a modern, so the question of the critique is of course a very important question. The critique part is an attempt at presenting what are the different ways in which thinkers throughout history, from the pre-Socratics to let's say the modern, have dealt with, well, let's say, the impossibilities of law. At the moment when law was, developed and erected and instaurated as something important, let's say in Plato's understanding of what law is and the role that law plays in the city, up to Kant's, let's say, metaphysics of mores, when he speaks also about the moral law and the way law articulates itself under a general system of formalism. You have the development of a certain ambition for law throughout at least the history of European philosophy. But Deleuze shows that at the same time, this image of law that unfolds progressively as something which is anchored into a superior good and helps us in bringing something like a better in society, making society better. This image of law and of its role is undermined by other figures that are contemporary to those who, create the different steps of this history and ruin it at the moment when it is presented at its most authoritative. In the case of Plato, is Socrates, of course, who dies under the law, under the rules of Athens, showing that the law in questions are everything but based on a common good and anything but the evidence that laws, serves for the better. And it's the same also with the figure of Kant, where Deleuze develops there a series of reading of Sade, of Sacher Mazor himself, but also of Kafka, of Melville and others, where he would show that the kind of pure formality of the law, considered as the embodiment of the supreme good, according to Kant, for instance, is destroyed by the possibility of designing, in the case of Sade, the statutes, the rules of the society of the friends of the crime, or in the case of Sacher Mazor, the possibility to create weird, pervert consequences out of the strict observance of law through the contract, the masochist's contract, and so on and so forth. So there's a very deep and all-encompassing and very powerful critique of both the history of Western law, but also its pretense at building up something like, a legitimacy or a pertinence or even a truth. So showing that every time that law presents itself as something noble, something important, actually it's already crumbling on its own base or in its own foundations. But at the same time, there is something else that happens, and that's, let's say, At the moment when the critique reaches its utmost intensity, suddenly it reverts into something different that Deleuze calls a clínica of law, which is the possible exploration of what, as a matter of fact, is left out from this enterprise of legitimation, but that it's still produced through the very idea or the very heading of law. And that's where, indeed, the linguistic issue that you're mentioning plays a crucial role in our conversation, because the only language that could not help in understanding this, and that's also the literature on Deleuze and law in English is so bad, it's so misled to some extent, is that because in English you will translate droit, jus, direito, derecho, direito, whatever you can think of, in the objective sense, you will translate it with rights, which has no meaning whatsoever, because rights are, the things that we as individuals possess and that we can use against the law, but thanks to the law. So this against the rules, but thanks to the rules. It's some kind of a dance, which makes the dance between law as legislation, norms, regulation, and rights as subjective rights, some kind of a pervert tango, so to speak. But it lacks there the possibility of the objective meaning of law, an objective meaning which is extracted, or which is let's say separated from the language of rules. Because as a matter of fact, and this is something very complicated to understand, especially for lawyers, law has nothing to do with rules, nothing whatsoever. Rules, fine, they exist, they're highly problematic, and the critique of rules is very important, and we have to do that, and we have to fight for it, but it's a political struggle. From the point of view of law and how it works in the objective sense, rules are simply data. You can change it from one day to the other, and it will not alter whatsoever the functioning of law. Think of marriage. One day it's a heterosexual marriage, the other day is gay marriage. Does the law change? No, it does not. The rules have changed, but the law itself, the system of marriage remains the same. So when we think about law in the objective sense, we have to force ourselves into imagining that it is possible to think of law in the terms of the operations such as marriage, obligation, filiation, and all these things that have been invented indeed by Roman lawyers under the heading of use, but that have nothing to do with the legislation that will eventually enforce it or provide context for it or input for it, but that will not explain the functioning of it. And Deleuze was very well aware of that, because he was a very good reading of historians of Roman law of his period, mostly one of the good friends of Michel Foucault, Paul Veyne. And he had understood that there was something happening with law that could be separated from this critique of rules, because as a matter of fact, the image that I was speaking about, the image going through the history of the building up of law, was actually the building up of a certain idea of law based on legislation and reaching its apex with the French Civil Code, so to speak. So what Deleuze does is that he tries to dig back from modernity through the Roman times in order to find back this kind of kernel that resists some kind of the hostile takeover by legislation and by ought to be upon the very functioning of law, to see if there is something that could escape the critique and lead us to a truly experimental dimension. And that's the key word here. How can we unfold the experimental side of law? Is there an experimental side? Deleuze was persuaded that there was, but how can we unfold it, and how can we use it again? And Deleuze saw it, of course, in a certain practice of jurisprudence, not in the sense of legal theory, but jurisprudence in the sense of the legal practice of judges. We can discuss that. I'm not sure I do agree with this, but I think that the true issue there is outside of the courts, actually. But he saw it in the practice of legislation, of jurisprudence, and especially in the common law tradition. So the idea that whatever you have that counts as a legal context or as a normative context, this normative context is only a background. And what matters is how the law allows you to dig through this background and then to build up consequences that are unexpected from the point of view of this background. So there is some kind of a plea, an underlying plea for, let's say, a legal practice that defeats the law in permanence, that permanently defeats the law. And the law is always behind the practice that make it slide into another direction, building up what Isabelle Stengers will call an art of consequences. What Deleuze was interested was indeed that movement, the movement where what matters is what comes next, and not how you are going to justify or legitimize or find the right causes and so on, so the right principles behind your back. And I think that this experimental dimension that is, let's say, the final perhaps conclusion out of the final lesson out of its double historical digging. I pass on the details there in the book, so if you're interested, you will read that. But really lead to this experimental plea, or this plea for an experimental take on law that finally leave the question of the norms aside, because the true struggle, the true fight, and the true revolutionary power of law is not in the rules, but in the fact that hidden by the rules, that law is first and for all, an extraordinary operational machinery of operations and techniques that the rules cannot touch, actually.
Perfect. Well, Laurent, in my opinion, there would be a very strong thesis in your Deleuze that is the following. Law as droit, direito, or use is a practice which constitutes the future of philosophy, the realization of a program of transcendental empiricism which is already presented in Deleuze philosophy. At the same time, you told me these days you've been working in a book on post-critical law. And it happens that here in this channel, we really cultivate spoilers. We think spoilers do not spoil anything, especially when it comes to cutting-edge philosophy. So in what sense does the practice of law as droit, as direito, or use, promote philosophy? How do you comprehend the relationship between the practice of law as a transcendental jurisprudence and this notion of a post-critical law?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I would say that if there is a link between law and philosophy, or if there is a lesson to be drawn out of Deleuze's presentation of law and his own philosophical interest into law, I think that the lesson would be for us precisely to think in terms that are not strictly philosophical. I would say that law there has a lesson that can lead us into seeing and realizing how philosophy itself is completely linked historically, but also conceptually, with the idea of law as rules. And that it is a high time, of course, to free thought from the legislation of philosophy, because philosophy has had this position from Plato up to the great masters of the late 20th century, the late 20th century, and up to the present, of providing some form of sovereign form of thought. And I think that we need a proletarian form of thought, a daily form of thought, and that maybe law, because it's so boring. Right, let's face it, so boring, so daily, so petty, pathetic little thing. Somebody has stolen a priceless bag in some shop and then ends up in prison. I mean, these are truly small acts that should first give us the put back the scale, put the scale back where it truly belongs. I don't see the need for thinking about, grand scheme, the common good, all these kind of discourse that provides some very, so all-encompassing thing and and majestic narrative about society, about politics, about whatever. So first, the idea would be that if law provides a model for anything, provides a model for the possibility of a democratization of thought. And I think that Deleuze had that in mind, even though he was so much of a philosopher and so much of a classical philosopher too. This is something which is often overlooked and that Alain Badiou very rightfully pointed out. I mean, he is a very classical philosopher, and he was very intense about that. He was very proud of that. I mean, it's not an insult. I mean, it's something that Deleuze was persuaded to be part of a history, but a history that he could overcome, or that he could lead to some other place. And law, from his perspective, gave or provided the model, and provided the model precisely because it was, to some extent, or it is to some extent, post-critical. I mean, like you, I've been raised as a lawyer and as a legal theorist through my reading of critical legal studies and postmodern jurisprudence, all these schools of thought that said at the time, oh, come on, forget about this, Habermas or Rawls liberal thing. It's pure ideology. It's pure attempt at justifying the unjustifiable, namely the current state of the state and the state of the rule of law and powers that they are, and so on and so forth. And critical legal studies and postmodern jurisprudence and others, they pointed out, and quite rightly, at the fact that when we speak about law, we speak about power, violence, domination. So we have to see that, and we have to face that, and we have been raised by that. So I don't want to, let's say, criticize them or smash them and so on and so forth. But I think that what Deleuze tells us is that this reflex of critique is only half of the work. And at some point, when you get stuck into the critique of law, you get stuck, as a matter of fact, in the critique of regulation. You get stuck in the critique of politics, and you miss the law. And if you want to get to the law, indeed, there's a moment when you have to make a move away or a move beyond a critique in order to find back the possibility to, from the point of view of law itself, from the inner power of law, to put it to some other place, or to displace it and to make it useful for other purposes. And I've always been fascinated by how lawyers are shy in using the law. Maybe it's for reasons obvious. I mean, social reasons. They are part of the bourgeoisie and part of the dominant class, if we still use this expression. So they don't have any interest in using the law against the law. But I think that there's indeed a possibility that Deleuze teaches us about, and that that it's high time that we grasp, and that we grasp not in a critical point of view, because in the end we simply give back all the power of law to those who already have it. We're just saying, well, we just need other ways in teaching law. We need revolution. We need, I don't know, a new president. We need Roberto Mangabeira Unger as the Minister of Justice, and that will be all fine. No, it will not. Okay, so I think that there is something there that is very important, very deep, and is directly linked to this idea of transcendental empiricism, namely the idea of the fact that, again, what matters is what comes forward, and how solid you will be able to build up the chain of operations that will produce the next consequence. So the question will also always is a question. I mean, Bruno Latour was very well described that in his book on the fabric of law, right? The idea of this kind of chain of consequence and the solidity of the chain of consequence that you build, and which is actually the speciality of law. That's what law does. Law does, and pragmatically speaking, it makes exist necessities. We can speak about the context of the necessities, of course, as much as we want, but it builds up necessities. When you are declared married, you are married. When you have stolen something in a shop, you become a thief, and you can escape justice. You can escape police, and you can live your life. There are lots of crooks and very powerful crooks who live their perfect life, but there still are crooks, and the law makes it possible that they are transformed. And these are necessities that are part of the immense realm of necessities that law produces. So yeah, since it produces necessities, the question is how you will show yourself at the level of this necessity. And that's where we need thought, not only in philosophy, but we need thought everywhere. And that's why, because it emphasizes the robustness of necessities and the chaining of necessities and the linking of necessities in the hope of producing unexpected and new consequences to explore, that makes really the law, from that perspective, something to listen to, something to learn from. And I think that Deleuze, showed the way.
Thank you very much, my dear Laurent. This conversation was absolutely excellent. And I'm sure our audience is amazed and looking forward to read your Deleuze, now available in Portuguese. It's necessary to say that. If you want, you can leave 2 final words for your Portuguese-speaking readers.
Well, I would love to say them in Portuguese, and I feel ashamed and I blush at not being able. But I just want to say thank you, and I'm really thrilled to see that book in Brazil. And as you said, it's my first book in Brazil now, so I'm excited to have slightly conquered another part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you one more time, and tchau, which is Portuguese.
Thank you, Murilo.
Obrigado. Bye bye.